This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, starts the show for today with a grain market outlook. Dan discusses cash prices in the U.S., seasonal price trends, and international events taking place. The show keeps going with K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon as he talks about how removing crop residue from fields can impact the soil. He also provides an update on cotton. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends today's show with a recap of the recent moisture Kansas has received and if his forecast has Kansas getting more precipitation. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what's currently happening in the grain market?
Well, we're in the latter parts of fall harvest. Soybean harvest almost done, corn advancing strongly. Had some rains that have come that have slowed things down a little bit, but generally the end is near, other than straggling fields hard to get to in specific situations. And with that, of course, we've had more than ample supply at the local level in many, many areas. Pretty low cash prices, and the positive thing about low cash prices is that it helps spur demand. So we have seen pretty strong, really strong actually, corn and soybean export movement. And I would not doubt that as sorghum harvest, which at times in our part of the world can trail after corn, when that becomes available too, I wouldn't be surprised that countries like China would come strongly after U.S. Grain sorghum as well once the crop is in. So that's been good. You look at the news reports of the last several days in the grain markets and major sales to known and unknown destinations, 24, 25 marketing year. And good part of this has to do with the U.S. having the most available crops right now through at least the end of this year. South American crops start to come in, the early parts of them, once you get into January and February and on. So at this time, we're in a leading seat in the world export markets. Wheat has been less so for sales. You still have the Russian Black Sea supplies that are out there to be dealt with. And so overall, that's kind of where we're at. We have some improvement in the grains here yesterday, at least that you've got Dees corn, $4.20 or so. And, we had been closer to $4. So we've had arguably 20-some cents worth of strength there. November soybeans, November 24, over $10. So we have been lower than that here of late. We were at $9.80 thereabouts. Wheat still, again, with lesser amounts of export demand pull. December, hard Redmond wheat about $5.80, $5.85, something like that. So interesting to watch all the dynamics of that.
And Dan, you mentioned low cash prices. How low are cash prices?
Keep in mind, these prices are at harvest, and we've got trucks lined up taking grain either to on-farm side, well, some to users. Early on, we sold a lot of wet corn in western Kansas and parts of central Kansas where there are feedlots. But now with ample supplies around, you see the highest price available still in southwest Kansas, $4.60. This was at middle part of this week. We'll see. I'm unsure how everything else settled out after that. 40-cent over basis. Then you had $4.35 also at positive 15-cent basis in the Colby area. And for the rest, most strength actually in Hutchinson, Columbus area, $4.20, $4.10. Salina, still over $4, but in that northeast Kansas area, east central northeast, probably the weakest of areas in the state for right now with the price closer to $3.70, $3.75, $3.80, something like that. But just a lot available and not many livestock feedlots there or really close ethanol plants. I would say for grain sorghum, we have prices reflecting somewhat of the same pattern, but a little bit lower. Highest grain sorghum price actually in the Hutchinson area with that 10 under basis. Earlier this week, about 410 got up to. We'll see where it ends up this week at. Other prices, again, Salina, Garden City, both at 404, about 16 under. Colby, about 18 under at 402. But then more weakness in the Topeka and in this case in the Columbus area. And with harvest going on for soybeans, we're we have cash prices uniformly and resolutely below $10. So the highest price, strongest market actually is in southeast Kansas, Columbus. And again, that opening of a new soybean crush plant in that area has made a difference. And no doubt trying to attract bushels in and establish a market. But 986 price that had got up to middle part of this week, a 13 under basis. The next best basis was actually in the Hutchinson area at 29 under. So, that's what happens when we have a change in a market. Otherwise, 944, 945, and Salina, Topeka, and out to the west, closer to 9 or 915, something like that. Wider basis for sure. And I would say then to finish up with wheat, again, if anything, probably in the wheat market, we're most concerned about on the production side of actually getting moisture to grow what's been seeded or to finish up seeding if it's not been done yet. But cash prices for wheat, strongest price, Hutchinson area with a 28 under basis. Middle of this week, that was around 555, 560 as a top in that region. But then Salina, Topeka, just about the same, just a penny or two behind that. Again, 29, 30 under. So you got, again, the export-oriented parts of the state all giving basis levels about 28 to 30 under. But then you go outside of that, you're looking at like Garden City and Columbus, 54 to 59 under, and out to the west in the Colby area, the best bid about 71 under. So not sterling prices, but we're in harvest, and we'll see where things go from there.
Dan, we looked at cash prices in Kansas, but what about for around the country? You
do see some differentials off of a USDA Ag Marketing Service Grain Transportation Report. You can go in and see that if on October the 17th, they update that once a week. Here we had corn prices of $4.20 in Kansas. When you go to the Louisiana Gulf, corn price was $4.78. So interesting. You'd almost think it would be more of a differential, but that's what goes on to ships. So that's about a 58-cent differential. For soybeans, $9.19. In Kansas, that was at a terminal. I think it's probably around the Salina, Topeka area. So $9.19 in Kansas, $10.71 at the Louisiana Gulf. Hard red, $5.47 in Kansas. And now's when we would really hope to be shipping a lot of that. Down at the Texas Gulf, $6.90. So you've got about $1.50 differential. That $1.50 differential, when you look at the amount per bushel it costs to ship grain that's listed in that same report, matches up pretty well. So you've got shipping and a little bit of handling on the differentials. And we can also go out to the northwest with wheat. Here, again, $5.47 was the bid on the 17th in Kansas. You go out to Portland. When we'd go to Asian markets, hard reds at $6.40, so about 93 cents. So, if you're in the grain market space and looking to move grain to ethanol plant, that's more of a local move in most cases, or to a port to go overseas, then the cost of rail, or if you happen to be on a river location, for us, Port of Catoosa down in Oklahoma, to get to that and then down, you're looking at river transportation. So transportation's a name of a game once the crop's in the bin.
When we look at all these prices, is this following a seasonal price trend that we're used to?
In the last 5 years, we've seen, if anything, more pronounced seasonal trends. For corn, for the October time period, on average, we've had prices at about 92% of the season average price. That's in September, probably about 96% in October. We see our strength in the corn markets more in February. We get up to about 102%. Strongest markets actually in May in the last 5 years, and that's changed a little bit from the 5 years previous. But then after May highs, May, June perhaps, we tend to fall off pretty precipitously. Pretty similar pattern for sorghum. For soybeans, our October bid is about what we're in right now is typically the weakest bid of the year, about 92.5% of the season average price, the average over the 12-month marketing year. We jump up in January to about 102%, May to about 104%. The May-June period ends up being the highest. For wheat, we're just, in most cases, typically over the long haul, we're very, very level for wheat prices. But in the last few years, we have seen the highest prices come in March and in March, April, and May. So that's an issue. Do we tell people to hold wheat cash that long for the pattern they've seen the last several years? And no doubt, if people have bin space on farm, they've probably done that. They probably made some money in doing that, but it's a bit speculative. So much depends on how the wheat crop this year will come out, and it's pretty dry. So in our areas, if we continue to be dry for wheat, and then that extends through the winter months off into the spring, then tight basis, regardless of what futures do, pretty tight basis, and probably the chance of higher prices. We'll see.
And Dan, I want to take a quick look at an international thing that's happening right now that could impact the grain market.
Russia is part of a group of nations called the BRICS nations, BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they're seeking together to develop their own joint currency, basically to free them up from the U.S. dollar and protect them from sanctions. When things such as the Ukraine-Russia Black Sea region war come in, or China, they'd wonder about sanctions as well. They're seeking to form their own currencies, and also to Russia in their involvement in that, seeking to put a minimum price on, like, I think it's $250 per metric ton on the price of wheat that they'd sell. So that says something, that right now wheat market's weak enough that Russia's seeking to come together with these other countries and limit the downward move of wheat prices. Most experts think that although they're working towards this, there are a lot of internal motivations by each country, particularly between Russia and China, that will be in the way of that being a harmonious move. And really, I think some of the same issues that have plagued OPEC in the oil market will probably end up and will have to be dealt with if the BRICS situation were to work out.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show discussing some things producers might want to think about if they're planning to bale corn stalks or already have, with K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. Logan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Logan, when we're thinking about producers possibly baling corn stalks, there are a few concerns when it comes to soil.
Absolutely. So when we think about baling corn residues, we really need to think about the limitations that we might be placing on the system when it comes to conserving soil moisture, protecting our soil from erosion, as well as nutrient cycling, which we know are some of the really important services we get from maintaining those crop residues out on our fields.
How can soil moisture be impacted if people are taking that crop residue off the field?
Yeah, so crop residue is really an important part of soil moisture conservation, both in our irrigated and our dryland cropping systems. We increase our soil water storage primarily by increasing infiltration rates from our natural rainfall or our irrigation. We do that by reducing evaporative losses at the surface, lower soil temperature, lower wind speed. But another big factor here with infiltration really is limiting the impact of those water droplets on our soil surface. When we have our soil surface receiving the full impact of those water droplets, we can get surface sealing, water ponding, and runoff, and that just can really limit our ability to get that water into our system, and especially in Kansas, where we know water is our most limiting resource. We've got to do everything we can to be as efficient as possible getting that water into our system where our crops can use it.
What soil erosion concerns are there?
Yeah, so soil erosion is one of the biggest issues when we talk about residue baling, especially here in Kansas. And so it's both water and wind erosion, water erosion being a primary concern in eastern Kansas, wind especially in western Kansas. Crop residues protect our soil, again, from that full impact of those water droplets when we from either irrigation or natural rainfall. When we have that full impact on our soil surface, we get soil particle detachment and then movement with runoff. Big concern in eastern Kansas, especially as we see a lot of sedimentation issues in our reservoirs, nutrient loading in our reservoirs, and so forth. And then on the wind side, So percent residue cover, actual residue cover out there is so important for water, but also keeping that residue height is also important for wind erosion. And so we actually had some work done out in, actually in 3 sites across the state, in Colby, Hugoton, and Ottawa, Kansas. And in that research, they found some pretty significant impacts of residue removal, corn residue removal, on the structure of our soil. And so really can see where that plays in there, influencing our erosion potential.
When it comes to wind erosion, are there additional safety concerns?
Absolutely, absolutely. So when it comes to wind erosion, I mentioned some of the issues around water erosion, but with wind, we've got several considerations. One of them is air quality. When we get all of those dust particles up in the air, that creates a threat for human health and animal health alike, especially for those that have existing respiratory problems. Additionally, wind erosion has been a major cause of automotive accidents across Kansas. When we get low visibility with those larger dust events, we can also get damage to our machinery with abrasion, clogging as dust accumulates. And so the influence of wind erosion can also be really, really problematic for folks.
And we know topsoil is something really important when it comes to crops. And are there maybe a few concerns or considerations for people to take into account if they're considering baling up those stalks?
Yeah, so for topsoil loss, when we think about topsoil loss, we have degraded soil productivity. Anytime that we are removing some of that topsoil, we are going to reduce our soil productivity, keeping in mind that our topsoil really is where the majority of our organic matter is, a lot of our plant-available nutrients. And sometimes that, especially on wind erosion, it can be pretty insidious in that we don't always notice the losses that we're seeing, but can it really run up in the long term and be a big problem. Most of our agricultural soils in Kansas have what we call a T value, or tolerable amount of soil loss, of either 4 to 5 tons per acre per year. That's about equal to the thickness of a dime. And so when we think about prevention of soil loss, topsoil loss, some research that has been conducted by K-State across the state, we have seen that wind erosion and water erosion can be effectively prevented and limited by maintaining at least 30% ground cover or greater for water erosion and at least 50% for wind erosion.
How can removing this crop residue impact the nutrient cycle that usually takes place?
And this is something that gets brought up a lot more in eastern Kansas, but is something that we really need to think about across the state, is the nutrient removal that occurs when we're taking off those crop residues, the corn stalks, when we're baling. So something to keep in mind with nutrient uptake and partitioning in a crop like corn is that things like, say, our nitrogen and our phosphorus, we get a lot of removal in the grain with our harvest. So we're already removing quite a bit of that nitrogen and phosphorus, but the big consideration we really want to keep in mind for residue removal is that potassium. Most of the potassium taken up by a corn crop remains back in those stalks and in that way recycles in our system. And so when we start baling corn stalks on a regular basis, we can pretty quickly bring down our soil test potassium levels to points where we have to think more about managing that fertility with some soil amendments. And especially these days, which I feel like we say this all the time, so it's kind of a funny thing. These days, fertilizer prices are quite high, and so it's something that our producers really need to keep in mind with this.
Is there a way that producers could still be able to use this crop residue, but maybe help reduce some of these concerns?
Absolutely. So today we're talking about baling, and baling is one primary strategy to utilize these corn residues to get some additional income off those acres. But another popular strategy is grazing for those acres that we are able to get cattle out onto. The benefit of cattle grazing is that we tend to see more selective grazing when we put cattle out there. We're going to mitigate how much of that corn residue we're actually removing, so we're keeping more of it out there to meet some of the water management goals, meet some of those soil erosion management goals. And the big kicker here is just that nutrient cycling that occurs when we've got cattle out there versus where we're taking those nutrients off in the form of baled stock. So with that manure and urine deposition, as we've got cattle out on those acres, we really are connecting that nutrient cycle and avoiding some of that issue that we do see when we're taking that off in a bale.
Logan, if people want to read some more into this topic, any recommendations for them?
100%. So we have a really good publication available at the KSRE bookstore. It is titled Crop Residues, Abundance and Considerations for Alternative Uses. On that article, you'll see more information on management for corn residues as well as our abundant grain, sorghum, and wheat residues in the state, and so considerations on alternative uses and trade-offs.
Logan, while you're in, also wanting to take the time to do a quick update on what cotton is looking like.
The Kansas cotton crop is moving along. So I just was looking back at the report. We had about 110,000 acres of cotton planted in the state this year, and it's turning out to be pretty good. So what I was really surprised to see cotton harvest get started pretty early this year. We had our first modules hit the gin at Anthony on September 20th. We also had our first modules hit the Winfield, Kansas gin on October 2nd. So moving right along, especially that dryland cotton crop, folks were able to get out there and get their harvest aids applied and get to going on stripping. Down in the southwest over towards our Moscow, Kansas gin. In that area, folks were moving along with the dryland crop. They were, last I was down there, moving that along. And on our irrigated cotton crop in the southwest, things were a little bit slower in terms of wrapping that crop up, and so a little bit of a delay on getting those harvest aids out. But here, as of this week, I actually have gotten a couple days ago had my cotton get sprayed, and so we'll be waiting for those bowls to open and get ready to strip.
Wonderful, Logan. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will put a link to the resource that he mentioned, as well as an Agronomy e-update article that has more information on this topic. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we round out our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, this past week, Kansas saw some rain.
Yeah, earlier this week we did have a weak system that pushed through. It stalled out over eastern New Mexico and dumped over 5 inches of rain around Roswell, but then as it moved east into Kansas, mostly storms along a cold front, we saw precipitation not nearly to that extent. The highest amount we recorded on the Mesonet was nearly 3 inches in Phillipsburg, and that was thanks to an isolated storm. But other than that, most folks saw around 1/10 of an inch. Localized areas saw a little bit more than 1/4 inch, maybe a 1/2 inch. So not a lot of precipitation. In fact, when you look at average precipitation for this week, we're talking around 3/10 of an inch in the west to 8/10 of an inch in the southeast. So most folks didn't even get average precipitation, unfortunately, out of the storm.
What impact did that little bit of moisture have?
Well, unfortunately, not much impact. We did get heavy rains, and we had higher totals. It was a heavy rain, and so it likely ran off. Soil moistures only saw a bump up around Phillipsburg where we did get that rain event. Other than that, soil moisture profiles are pretty flat and with very little change and just continue dry. That precipitation ended the dry streak of about a tenth of an inch or less of moisture every day for about 30 days for a lot of folks in the west and central part of the state. Unfortunately, as you get further to the east and southeast, they didn't get any rain at all. And we're seeing the dry streak continue. It's not anywhere near record lengths by any means, but we've seen some records in 90 to 180 days without a tenth of an inch of moisture. But overall, long-term dryness prevails. And as a result, we saw drought expansion this week on the drought monitor. But even where we saw precipitation, we bumped up the drought monitor. About 10% of the state is now 10% more of the state now this week got added to severe drought, mostly in northeast Kansas. And we shrunk the nada or areas of no drought down to about 2% of the state in the southwest. So pretty much everyone's in a drought category of some type now, and we're seeing drought expansion continue almost on a weekly basis as this dry period continues.
And Chip, we've seen some cooler temperatures, but how do these temperatures compare to our average?
Yeah, cooler is all relative. We actually approached record temperatures several times over the last week, with values reaching into the 90s several times. But on the cooler days that we saw highs in the upper 60s to near 70, it's still 3-4 degrees above normal. And average low temperatures should be dipping into the 30s for a lot of the northern half of the state. And we did see a couple of 30s through the period over the last week, but they've been isolated and not very widespread. So we're remaining above normal even on those cooler days.
What can we expect looking forward?
Yeah, as we move forward, the temperatures are going to bounce around a little bit. We had a cold front come through overnight Thursday into Friday morning. That's going to bring cooler air for Friday, Saturday, and then temperatures start to escalate right back up to 80s and near 90 degrees on Monday and Tuesday. We're going to see winds dramatically increase Monday and Tuesday out of the south, some 40 and 50 mile an hour winds potentially. So it's also going to add to concerns of blowing dust and even some fire weather concerns as a result. And then that's part of a change in the wind is part of the pattern change we're going to see here midweek with a pretty impressive storm system that's supposed to move east across the Central Plains. Looks like around that Wednesday and the Thursday time period right now next week that could provide a chance for some precipitation. Right now models are saying someone's going to get some heavy rain. Most likely the eastern third of the state will be where precipitation does occur. And then that can shift around, hopefully shift a little bit further west and focuses more of the state precipitation. But Climate Prediction Center is predicting above normal probability of precipitation through Halloween. And then we'll have some cooler weather likely after that system.
Chip, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.